We're sitting here in New York City, a few months in advance of our Law and Poetry Conference in Paris. I have the great pleasure and privilege to be discussing law and poetry with Lawrence Joseph. We're going to hear some of his poems. I'll say my own judgment of Lawrence, who is a lawyer, is that he is the foremost lawyer poet creating and working actively in the United States. And we'll hear more about this as time goes on. There are folks at this symposium who are creating poetry in France who I think might be competitive, but Larry Joseph is the one to turn to, and we're very lucky to have him here today. Lawrence Joseph was born and raised in Detroit, the grandson of Lebanese and Syrian Catholics who were immigrants. He received a BA from the University of Michigan, where he studied English literature, an MA in English literature from the University of Cambridge, and a JD from the University of Michigan Law School. As a lawyer, he clerked for the Michigan Supreme Court, worked as a litigation associate at Sherman and Sterling, which many people today here know is a large international law firm, and mostly taught law, recently retiring from St. John's Law School, where he is professor emeritus. As a poet, he is the author of numerous highly acclaimed books, most recently A Certain Clarity, selected poems published by Farrar, Straus, and Giroux, described in the New York Times Book Review as a major work of American art. Not too shabby. He is also the author of Lawyerland. It's a wonderful prose book that I had the privilege of reviewing quite favorably many years ago here in New York, which he describes as a nonfiction novel. His work is widely anthologized and has been translated into several languages. I learned today, including French. His archive is housed at the Special Collections Library of the University of Michigan, and Larry lives in New York City. So with that as introduction, I'm going to turn the ball over to Larry. And among other things that we're going to hear over the next 20 to 25 minutes are some of his poems.
Thank you, Richard. And it's wonderful to be here. And I won't be able to come to Paris, but I certainly will be with all of you in what we're doing here, and certainly in spirit. So it's wonderful, Richard. Thank you for putting this together. I just want to talk a little bit more about my background, both as a lawyer and as a poet. As Richard mentioned in his introduction, I began really my legal career at the University of Michigan Law School. I considered that was the beginning of my career. And then I clerked for a judge in the Michigan Supreme Court, and his offices were in Detroit, where my wife and I lived. And then I taught at the University of Detroit School of Law, and then I went into practice. We moved to New York in 1981, and I was a litigation associate at Sherman and Sterling. And then I went back into teaching, and I've spent most of my career as a lawyer teaching. And as anyone who's been a legal academic, teaching law is very much part of being a lawyer. This is not only an academic pursuit. And my legal writing, scholarly writing, was in different areas of compensation and tort law, but also at a certain point I began writing on law and literature and language as the beneficiary of a whole body of of work that Richard was instrumental in bringing about. So that had an enormous effect on me. And my writing and scholarship also dealt with a number of types of issues. As a poet, I began writing poetry before I went to law school. I began writing poetry in 1967, which I was trying to say, what is that, 60? How many? Six? How many?
It's
Years ago.
a ways behind
It's a,
us.
and I've been writing it ever since. And and I was at the University of Michigan, and I studied with Donald Hall, who a wonderful teacher and very demanding, and became pretty much decided I was going to write. I didn't decide. It was, as I've said later, it was I was compelled by it, and to write poetry, and I've been writing it constantly in my mind since then. My first book was published in the early 1980s, and then it was followed by a book in the later 80s, and then a book in the early 90s. And by that point, I was firmly back into legal academia, and the generally, just as an introduction. My poetry is modernist. It's international. It comes out of international modernism, essentially, and certainly American modernism. And it deals with the kinds of issues that have been part of modernist writing, which for me goes back to Baudelaire, and then goes through in every country. In the world, really. Baudelaire had an impact on the entire world and the literature of the world literature. And so that's the general context of both backgrounds as being, both as a lawyer and as a poet. Now I wrote an article at one point called Being in the Language of Poetry, Being in the Language of Law. And what I wanted to do was, both these languages are, it's the same mind that does this. I don't compartmentalize this. So I'm constantly in both languages. The language of poetry is the language of aesthetics and tradition and all of the studying of the art and writing of the art and picking up on all of that. And I've been doing that constantly since I began writing it. Writing poetry. The language of law is the language that all of you who are lawyers know them since you began doing it, is the language of the social language. It's the primary social language in the United States. It virtually goes into every area of social reality. It goes into the primary issues of crime and punishment. It goes into wealth distribution. It goes into rights. It goes into racial structures, political structures. It goes to power. Lawyers operate in language of power. And this is a language that I learned, and it takes a while to become proficient in it. I felt it took about 15 years. If not longer, to become where I could pick up any kind of legal problem, and they still puzzle you at a certain point. It's because it's constantly evolving. But that's the language I've also lived in since I began law school in 1973 in Ann Arbor, and that's been that's the language of law and the language of poetry, which is a language of poetry, and which, of course, I write poems, and so I study how they're written. And because for me, making a poem, the word for poetry, the Greek word is poesis, which means making. So to me, it's a craft in the sense that you make it, and it's in the long lineage of poets who have been writing I think, since quote-unquote time immemorial. And it's probably the first type of expressive art. Comes out of probably music first, but music and poetry have always been intricately combined to the same thing, actually, because of the importance of music to writing poetry, where you don't have that importance in prose at all. And so that's the kind of overlap of it. What we're talking about when we talk about law and poetry, if you're talking about law and poetry and literature, generically or formally, lawyers and law are found in literary fiction. In fact, every major fiction writer and short story writer has dealt with law or lawyers at some point. Need I mention Dostoevsky, for example? As for law and lawyers in poetry, poets have written poems about law and about lawyers, but you don't have that kind of poetry. Tends to do other things, and most poets, even if they've written poems about law or about lawyers, do other things, do all sorts of other things. It's not their primary subject. At least the poets, the tradition that I come out of, which is not only the general tradition of poets, but poets who have also been lawyers. And primarily influence on me is the lawyer poet Wallace Stevens, one of the great American poets, who was a bond lawyer with the Hartford Company. The law and my being a lawyer and my poetry, I wrote something that I'm just going to, give as an introduction to my reading. I've written this before. From the beginning of my literary work, I've been aesthetically concerned with the ways in which poetry raises issues and questions of identity, and more basic to that, issues of the self. These include the nature of the self and the speaking self, the types of language that deal with a sense of the self, and how a self or selves who speak in a poem are constructed through various vocal languages that reflect personal and social identities in an ongoing process of narrative and metaphorical self-revelation. The core identity revealed in the poems is the identity of the poet, within the poem, making the poem. Other identities are expressed in the voices of a Catholic of Lebanese and Syrian descent, born and raised in Detroit, a resident of the blocks around Ground Zero in New York, who speaks with a complex set of personal and social realities, which include, among others, urban life in Detroit, the tension between high finance and the streets of New York, familial and religious ties to the Middle East, social issues, and issues of political economy. One self of the many expressed selves is also identified as a lawyer. Like William Carlos Williams, the great American poet who was also a doctor, a poet and author of literary, and also a poet and author of literary prose, excellent literary prose. I've chosen to identify a lawyer self in my poetry, as Williams does. Williams puts the doctor identity into the poems in his prose. Stevens does not. And so I follow Williams on that, who's a very important influence, as is Stevens, both who had other professions. The Williams critically reflects on his life or I critically reflect on my life as a lawyer and law itself, presenting a kind of lawyer's language alongside the other languages of identity expressed in the poems. The first poem I'd like to read is the title poem of my second book, Curriculum Vitae, which was published in the late 80s. It's the first of my poems where my lawyer self appears. The poem to a French reader is close in form to the prose poem. All of my poems are, actually, the great French language poetic form that goes back to Baudelaire. Curriculum Vitae. I might have been born in Beirut, not Detroit, with my right name. Grandpa taught me to love to eat. I am not Orthodox or Sunni, Shiite or Druze. Baptized in the one true church, I too was weaned on St. Augustine. Eisenhower never dreamed I wore corrective shoes. Ford Motor Company never cared I'd never forgive Highland Park, River Rouge, Hamtramck. I memorized the Baltimore Catechism. I collected holy cards, prayed to a litany of saints to intercede on behalf of my father who slept through the sermon at 7 o'clock Mass. He worked 2 jobs, believed himself a failure. My brother believed himself, my sister denied. In the 5th grade, Sister Victorine, astonished, listened to me recite from the book of Jeremiah. My voice changed. I wanted women. The Jesuit whose yellow fingers cracked with the stink of camels promised me eternal punishment. How strange I was, with impure thoughts, brown skin, obsessions. You could tell by the way I walked, I possessed a lot of soul. You could tell by the way I talked, I didn't know when to stop. After I witnessed stabbings outside the gym after the game, I witnessed fire in the streets. My head set on fire in Cambridge, England, in the Wim Cafe. After I applied substance and procedure and statements of facts, my head was heavy and was earth. Now years have passed since I came to the city of great fame. The same sun glows gray on 2 new rivers. Tears I want do not come. I remain many different people whose family populate half Detroit. I hate the racket of the machines, the oven's heat, curse bossmen behind their backs. I hear the inmates' collective murmur in the jail on Beaubien Street. I hear myself say, what explains the Bank of Lebanon's liquidity? Think, I too will declare a doctrine upon whom the loss of language must fall, regardless whether Wallace Stevens understood senior indebtedness in Greenwich Village in 1906. One woman hears me in my sleep plead the confusions of my dream. I frequent the Cafe Dante, earn my memories, repay my moods. I am as good as my heart. I am as good as the unemployed who wait in long lines for money. Well, the next poem I'd like to read is a section of a poem, Admissions Against Interest, which appears in my 3rd book, Before Our Eyes, which was published in the 1990s. The title has a legal metaphorical meaning. That admission against interest is a rule of evidence in which a person's statement, otherwise inadmissible, may be used when the content of the statement is so prejudicial to the person making it that he or she would not have made it unless he'd believed it was true. In the poem's 2nd part, the poem's lawyer self is made explicit. From Admissions Against Interest, 2. Now, what type of animal asks after facts? So I'm a lawyer. Maybe charming, direct yet as circumspect as any other lawyer, going on about concrete forces of civil society, substantially beyond anyone's grasp, and about money. Things like, you too may be silenced the way powerful corporations silence contractually, attract my attention. The issue's bifurcated. Why divide the dead, the foreign minister asks. What's one life when you've lost 20 million? And if what has happened during my life had been otherwise, could I say I would have seen it much differently? Authority? Out of deeper strata, illuminations. A lot of substance chooses you, and it's no one's business judging the secrets each of us needs. I don't know what I would do without my double. The next poem I'd like to read is entitled Variations on a Theme. It's also in Before Our Eyes. And again, in one section, not in every section, a lawyer self is brought to the foreground. Variations on a theme. Winter dragged on. Established remnants fell apart, displaced by chaos, by functions. Take the renowned banker who's murmuring the socialization of money has become an abstract force, and he's nervous. In the background, out of the ground of being, a resident of the hill in her tin hut at the end of the Manhattan Bridge insists she possesses a master's degree in English. 2. My friend the priest is studying Malcolm's X, how Detroit Red decided to redesign his sorrow. The X across, he contends, though none of it the Gnosticism popularized in certain circles. The way my friend sees it, the species is undergoing a cerebral mutation. 3 distinct types will survive. Those who need to kill, those who wait silently for transformation, and those, the militants, seesawing between the murderers and the victims. 4. And that's the law, to bring to light most hidden depths. The jurors screaming, defendants the devil staring at her, making her insane. The intense strain phrasing the truth, the whole truth, nothing but sentences, endless sentences. The war is a few days old. In the ever blue, the sun continues its journey. You won't kill their love of the actual. Let them go conquer the world, march with Alexander. There is Ur, the Chaldean city, a bronze flake on a rock. There are millions plunged and numbed by dreams of blood. It was then I had an attack of madness. The eyewitness account, the vanquished, appeared as if from a mirage of hot, oily smoke in search of someone to surrender to, which almost made me smile. What are you saying? This light is famous. Its sad secret violet, and this evening, west and east rivers turned into one. To remember and imagine at the same time. That was the month of June that year. Within the intensity you showed me, both cloudiness and transparency can be painted. And then 2 more poems. The first is the title poem of my book, So Where Are We?, which was written completed just before the 2016 presidential election. My wife Nancy and I live in Lower Manhattan, a block away from what was September 11, which was on September 11, 2001, ground zero. Although there's no lawyer self expressly in this poem, a lawyer's language with other language is present throughout it. So where are we? So where were we? The fiery avalanche headed right at us, falling, flailing bodies in midair, the neighborhood under thick gray powder on every screen. I don't know where you are. I don't know what I'm going to do, I heard a man say. The man who had spoken was myself. What year? Which Southwest Asian war? Smoke from infants' brains on fire from the phosphorus hours after they're killed. Killers reveling in the horror. The more obscene, the better. The point at which 100,000 massacred is just a detail. Acid and credit bubbles about to burst. Too much consciousness of too much at once. A tangle of tenses and parallel thoughts. A series of feelings overlapping a sudden sensation felt and known. Those chains of small facts repeated endlessly in the depths of silent time. So where are we? My ear turns like an animal's. I listen. Like it or not, a digital you is out there. Half of that city's buildings aren't there. Who was there when something was, and a witness to it? The rich boy general conducts the Pakistani heroin trade on a satellite phone from his cave. On the top floor of the Federal Reserve, in an office looking onto Liberty at the South Tower's one-time space, the Secretary of the Treasury concedes they got killed in terms of perceptions. 10 blocks away, the Church of the Transfiguration. In the back, a Byzantine Madonna. There is a God who fits the drama in a very particular sense. What you said, the memory of a remembered memory, the color of a memory, violet and black. The lunar eclipse on the winter solstice, the moon a red and black and copper hue. The streets, the harbor, the light, the sky, the blue and cloudless, intense and blue morning sky. Which was the sky that morning of September 11, 2001. And finally, I like to read a poem in parentheses, which is also in So Where Are We? It's in parts, they're small parts. The poem's speaker announces his lawyer identity in the poem's first part, making himself distinctly present in the poem's remaining 9 parts, telling what the poet lawyer self has to tell metaphorically in parentheses, within the book's other poems and throughout the poet's my work from the beginning. In parentheses. One. As I said, I'm a lawyer. Technically speaking, is a head blown to pieces by a smart bomb, a beheading. 2. Infinitely compressible, yet expandable. Time and curved space. In the preface to Lucretius' first book of De Rerum Natura is a tribute to Venus. In the last book, a description of the plague. 3. Estimated 1 to 2,000 militia, gangs really, of 15 to 3,000 armed killers, and separate overlapping networks, difficult to differentiate. And now this, to quote an anonymous State Department source, what no one could have predicted, this phenomenon's the caliphate's rise. Nothing since the triumph of the Vandals in Roman North Africa, this sudden, this incomprehensible. 4. In the techno-capital sphere, absolute principles of profit growth, of value accumulation, the absolute freedom to recombine the production of raw materials into virtual information in spaces of time, info time. 5. A theological political fragment, a mythographical scriptural text, and sorrow. To understand the meaning of sorrow. Saint Sorrow, the addressee of my avowal, Saint Sorrow's stern vigil necessary to keep. 6. Hyperviolence is the word, of epic proportions, a species thing, the point at which violence becomes ontology, these endless, ambitious experiments in destruction. A species, grief. 7. Quite often, almost daily, in fact, I have strong impressions of eternity. My ancestors are there too, in the shadows. My mother, my father, grandmothers, grandfathers, whom I refuse to let perish, whispering to me to be careful. 8. What's that about? Someone I heard say that to say that Hispanics are East Asian is sort of like saying that Arabs are white. 9. Hear that? That man's face stepped on, skull being cracked by the baton stick, head slammed against the concrete edge, blood in his eyes, body limp, in the process now of being handcuffed. 10. I am speaking of a law now, understand. That point at which bodies locked in cages become ontology. The point at which structures of cruelty, force, war become ontology. The analog is what I believe in. The reconstruction of the phenomenology of perception, not according to a machine. More now for the imagination to affix to than ever before.
I think we all have to recognize not only the timeliness and obviously the relevance, so to speak, of Larry's poems as he just read them to us, to our topic, but also the beauty of these poems. And I think that in Paris, where our hope is, incidentally, that our conversation will be sous-titré, that there'll be French subtitles, and that will include translation of Larry's poems, although these translations exist already, right? So we may have to
Well,
talk about
only in one book. So I think that the translators will probably put them just sentence by sentence in French.
probably.
That would.
I'm
In other
told.
words, because they're, as I indicated, for a French reader, these poems are, because of their detail and the narrative dimensions of it, are close to prose poems. They're not in the kind of compressed, kind of abstract language that you get in the great poetry of Mallarmé and Valéry and the symbolist poets.
Well, I want to get back to Mallarmé. I wrote my master's thesis at Cornell on Un coup de dé, which is kind of a poème en prose, kind of a prose poem. And I want to get back to the symbolist tradition that you've told us has so influenced your work.
Well, it's
Beginning
influenced French poetry, and Valéry his prose has had an enormous impact on me. I mean, he's one of the great thinkers in the world ever about
we'll
about
need to,
poetry.
I think, talk about that a little bit more. But this being a law and literature conference, I wanted to draw back just a little bit from the beauty of your work to situate you as someone going through your life early on as a devotee of what is sometimes called the law and literature movement. And I think both of us want to recognize, however briefly, the influence to this movement of Bishon and Stone, which was your first year required text, right?
No, it was a book called Law, Language, and Ethics. It was a Foundation Press book, and it
It's
cleaned.
only required at USC, by the way, and it still
Well,
might be.
I think that's right, and it came out in '72. But I was still in Cambridge, studying English literature. I hadn't started law school, but I started law school the year later, and one of the professors that I had in law school called attention to this book when he found out I was a poet and had been in Ann Arbor as a poet. He called attention to this book, and it really, really altered my way of thinking about law and literature and writing, and it had an enormous impact on me, and it had an enormous impact on you.
It did. And as we think about the law and literature movement more broadly, what are the origins of the movement? What are the texts? What are the important texts? I think our common experience engaging Bishop and Stone very early on needed to be marked today as an important moment in both of our lives. So it's Bishop and Stone, Law, Language, and Ethics. It's still around. It's a fundamentally important work for our movement and for us as individuals.
But can I ask you a question on this? That this came out in '72, and you were well into your legal career in '72. I hadn't even begun law school yet.
I wasn't into my legal career. I was teaching French and comparative
Ah,
literature at the University of Chicago and taking courses at Chicago while teaching across the Midway, but also at Columbia. I won a grant to help me get back to Columbia, where I had had my first year of law school. And I got my law degree during the time that I was actually teaching essentially French literature, but also comparative literature. But I ran into Bishop and Stone during my embedded law school training, which took place during those years. And clearly they were just an eye-opener for me because thinking about law as some kind of arid, unimaginative language was impossible after that. Not that I ever really did. And that text, and there were others, reading and teaching Camus especially, which you and I have talked about, were at the origins of my own engagement eventually in what's called law and literature.
but you were among, if not the first after Bishop and Stone. I mean, to literally begin to define this as law and literature, and then what took off from it. And your definitions of it uh, were always dealing with a language, ethics, and morality, and which is part of the numerous readings in this 1,000-page book that they put together. And so,
Right. And my second book, and the first major book on law and literature, is called Poethics, which is a neologism putting together poetry and ethics.
and
And that was already announced in Bishop and Stone, Law, Language, and Ethics. So we were both paying homage to that text, which could too easily slide through the cracks when people sort of look at the origins of what has become a fairly important movement. From there, if you don't mind, I want to turn to power. Now, power is a voice within your poems. I don't think there's a single poem that you recited today that doesn't relate in one way or another to the institutions of power. For example, in parentheses, strophe 3, if you want to put it that way, you mention an anonymous State Department source. And in strophe 4, you say, in the techno-capital sphere, absolute principles of profit growth, of value accumulation, the absolute freedom to recombine the production of raw materials into virtual information in spaces of time, info, time. And there are numerous other apostrophes, gestures towards power structures. I am reminded, still thinking of sort of the development of law and literature as a movement, of the novelist Louis Auchincloss. And I do want to add to the deservedly great things that have already been said about you, that you, along with Auchincloss and Begley, were the recipient of the New York City County Lawyers Award. This is astounding, and that was like 2006, I think. Pretty good company. But
I was very honored
Did you
by it and by being in that company.
Did you meet Auchincloss
I've never really read
or
Auchincloss.
Begley?
Begley I've read.
Yeah.
Begley is not only a first-rate lawyer, and as Auchincloss was. I mean, to be in that
Auchincloss
company.
was an estate lawyer, and Begley, right.
Begley
and there
was,
are other lawyer, not so much poets, but lawyer novelists. For example, Solmsen out of Philadelphia.
Did you know Auchincloss?
Auchincloss. I would say also of interest, I think, to our audience here is that when some of the first writings came out in the law and literature movement, Auchincloss was deeply upset that radicals had taken over the academy and that they were primed to to take over the practice of law.
You're among these radicals?
Yeah, and Robin West, a mutual friend of ours, were specifically named in journals like Commonwealth by Auchincloss as severe threats to the stability of the power structure.
That's the way I've always thought of you and Robin, actually.
Yeah, very good. Well, we didn't really know that we were time bombing the entire enterprise. Auchincloss was pleased that Richard Posner had entered the fray. Not all of us were, though I sort of encouraged him to do that, for better or worse, to stabilize things and make sure that in readings of stories like Billy Budd, the authority figure would always be privileged and seen in a positive light. This is something that's universal in Richard Posner's misreadings of almost every story that he's taken up. And Auchincloss was happy to see that. Whereas Robin and I and many others tended to undermine, through readings of the story, the symbols of authority, institutional and personal, within the tale. And what I wanted to ask you apropos of that, and given the readings today, is it seems to me that if I'm putting this in hyperbolic terms, if Auchincloss, given his views, which are pretty well known and knew that you were the recipient of the same award that he had gotten, he also might have been quite upset. I think your writing is not polemical at all, the poems.
I think he also did admiralty law, and I taught torts for 35 years, or I don't even lost count at some point.
Roman law, wonderful.
Well,
field.
he was in admiralty law is a lot of admiralty law in New York because of the water. So I would have talked to him about admiralty law and the common law of admiralty law and where it fits into tort cases. The great Carroll Towing case, but in torts that probably all of the American lawyers read in law school.
The formula from Learned Hand.
It's an admiralty case. Right. So that I would have talked to him about that. Whether that would have, appeased it all.
Let me ask you more generally whether you feel that, for whatever of the many autobiographical reasons might be plugged in here, that your poetry is skeptical, is the way I would put it, about power.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, that's structures of power is the way I use it now from the very beginning. It's a poetry of resistance against power and violence and state structured or socially structured violence. It comes from the very beginning. I have and I write about war. I've written about war in every book, and as I've told people recently, we're at war. We're at war now. Essentially there's a world war because of Russia, and the whole world is involved in it. And you still see it in the newspapers. Are we moving toward a Cold War? And I go, we're not in a Cold War. We're in a hot war. I mean, it's everywhere. It's through the entire world. And it comes in the source of what's happening in Russia and Europe and whatever. And it's just like, it's going to be with us the rest of my life. And so the concept of permanent war, which became very much part of the moral universe that I come from, in terms of American wars, going back to Vietnam, and going back to I was born in 1948, 3 years after the ending of the World War II with the dropping of the atomic bomb. And so I grew up as you grew up. We grew up in war, the post-war war. And so that's there from the beginning. In addition, which probably would have rubbed Auchincloss. I don't know how Auchincloss would have rubbed. I come from a lower middle class then, because my father's business failed. He went to work as a meat cutter and was unionized. And so I come from a kind of a in leftist terms, a petty bourgeois, failed petty bourgeois working class union. And so so that very much informs the way I think. I'm also from Detroit, which is an extremely important city in world history, especially in the 20th century. It was the great industrial city, and not only in the United States, but in the world, and historically. And then where Detroit, sort of is now, and has been in my lifetime. I was born into a Detroit 1950, and then we've been in New York and lived in Lower Manhattan almost the entire time.
Let's talk a little bit about the lawyer voice, which is so powerful in the poems that you read to us today, in view of what we were just mentioning about power. One of my favorite poems is called Any and All. You didn't reference it today, but if you don't mind, I'm going to read it.
Okay.
Because I love reading your stuff out
All right.
loud. The lawyers from Mars and the bankers from Switzerland have arrived to close the deal. The money in their heads articulated to the debt of the state of Bolivia. How much later the Croatian woman who empties the waste baskets laughs when you answer, "You've been better and you've been worse." How much sooner you're told not to tell anyone Birdman's grandfather was a Jew. How much number 54 Wall Street, emblematic reality of extreme speculations and final effects. This is one of my favorite poems, and of course it evokes Bartleby, and anybody who, like us, has spent any time in the practice of corporate law. Just so many things are going off in our minds as we read this.
Yeah, Melville's Bartleby is a scrivener, which would be the equivalent, roughly, of an associate.
Yeah.
And I became Melville's a very important writer to me.
I know.
And because I've lived in downtown Manhattan. I mean downtown, like what's now called the financial district area.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
there's a beautiful poem at the end of Billy Budd called Billy and the Darbies, which the sailors have written in memory of their beloved foretopman, unjustly sent to his death. And Melville's poetry, as you undoubtedly know much better than I, is sublime and worth reading on its own. Let me talk to you a little bit about Camus, another influence on both of us. And if you like, prior to Camus, if you want to get back to Baudelaire. Um, please elaborate a little bit, if you wish, on those French
Camus.
influences.
I began really closely reading Camus when I was in England and I was in Europe, and I hadn't studied French, but one of the exams for Cambridge, a language exam, was in French, and so we had to translate basically, and so I learned to read French. And one of the texts that was possibly going to be translated was a Camus text, but I read everything that I could by Camus that was available at the time in English translation. And then I bought the two Pleiades that were there at the time, and I would read them in French. I kind of learned French from reading Camus. The thing that struck me the most was the moraliste, the what Sartre said about Camus, that he comes out of the French moraliste tradition, which and there was a exam or a paper at Cambridge which was called the moralist paper, and
That was at Magdalen College.
yes, well, Magdalen
great
College,
college.
Cambridge, yeah,
Yeah.
and I wanted to sort of focus on Camus. I did a whole paper on Camus, especially on the stuff after 1945-46, when he was beginning to go into his next phase with after the first books. Camus was also very important to what was then called the Catholic left.
Mm-hmm.
Both Thomas Merton and Daniel Berrigan
Oh, yeah.
were very, very affected by Camus' nonviolence, and really close to being a pacifist, and his hatred of war and violence,
And of capital punishment.
racism, capital
A
punishment.
leader, but never saw success in his lifetime.
Yes, that's
But-
exactly right. He wrote a great thing with Kessler, Arthur Kessler, Reflections on the Guillotine,
Yes.
which is a remarkable book, and the history of his father going to execution and whatever, and it comported entirely with my moral sensibility, Camus, and he still comports entirely to my moral sensibility, and
Mine too. Mine too. And as far as what we referenced a little bit earlier, I don't know if you wanted to elaborate at all about Baudelaire and the poems and prose of Saint-Jean-Pierre. Clearly you've been quite influenced by this.
Well, a number of poets have. I mean, French poets always at some point.
Including Yves Bonnefoy, if I...
Yeah. Sometimes the prose poems are very abstract. Sometimes they have detail in them. They're not lineated, and my poems are lineated. I don't write prose poems, but what you can do in a prose poem, and what Baudelaire and Rimbaud did in prose poems, is they could get detail and types of different kinds of narrative structures that you couldn't do in the more compressed poems, where you had the rhyme and you had your meter, that they were very, in their traditions of meter and rhyme. So you could open it up, and it still was poetry, because it was, the narrative structures were so compressed and associative that they're poetry, the way poetry moves. It's not fiction. It's not.
Yeah.
And it's poetry, and so it's constantly associative, creating spaces, moving through different subjects, surprising you, and everything else. But after Baudelaire and Rimbaud, virtually that became part of world literature, to write in virtually every world literature, because of the effect that Baudelaire had on world literature. So it was you were getting prose poems in every eventually in every language of poetry, and now it's very common that nobody even, prose sections, poems, and then prose sections and whatever. But that comes out of the it's kind of counter to the, not counter, it's a kind of way of writing poetry that isn't in the kind of metrical pressures that you get, metrical pressures you get in that vein of, which is the, the goes back very far in French literature. I mean,
I want to bring this around as we're concluding our conversation, which was so meaningful, at least to me, to the image of the double that one of the poems you read today includes. And of course, in some ways, it's could become a 6-hour conversation when you're talking about the lawyer poet. Now, it's a double. I don't know if it's a Faustian bargain. Faust said that he has, Goethe's Faust, that he has two Fausts in his soul. There are two Fausts. Or, as I think you explained earlier, whether the lawyer and the poet are really unified somehow within you. And the double is, speaking of Rimbaud, je est un autre, But that's not, I think, where you're coming from at all. Camus also has in La Chute, Clémence, the lawyer, has two faces, like Janus. So I wondered if you could just sort of close.
I am coming from that whole notion of the double. The Wallace Stevens said he was asked, because he was like the dean of surety bond lawyers in the United States, and he was basically a vice president, in-house counsel for Hartford. He established the surety bond work, which is very high-pressured, fact-oriented work, and he puts stays away from fact, where Williams is constantly dealing with factual descriptions. But he said he was asked, and he did a talk at Yale in 1948, I think, and he said he brought his briefcase, and he said this, and he brought out one file, and he said, "This is my poetry file, and this is my law file." And he was later asked, basically, do they compete and whatever? And he says, that's my mind. They don't compete. It's just, that's the way I think. That's the way I feel. I mean, these are languages that I know. And I've been speaking to you and everybody in Paris as a lawyer and poet, but also as a lawyer. I mean, and the language, where the language tends toward what lawyers can learn from language, from where lawyers go, you all understand that. So if I write about capital, of course you understand capital. I write about the Federal Reserve, of course you understand the Federal Reserve. I write about war, of course you understand war. I write about racism, of course you understand racism. Police brutality, quote unquote, of course you understand it. Lawyers, this is our language. And I've never been somebody that said that. Let me put it another way. I don't compartmentalize it at all. Is it a Faustian bargain? I never got to that point. It was just as the way it happened, and the reason I primarily did it is because I wanted to be free to write the way I wanted to write and not be affected by what was happening in the literary world at the time, which was creative writing programs and or even English departments. And I said, I'm not going to do that. And the market was tight in 1972, and it had tightened from where it had been in the 1960s. And I just decided that I would do what Stevens did. I'll build a career and I'll take it very seriously, and I will do the best I can in that career. I'm not going to, I will, of course, continue to write poetry because I had made that decision well before I went to law school.
Well, we are so much richer
Thank
to have you on record and to have heard these beautiful poems. And in Paris, we'll be celebrating you, wishing that you were there.
Thank you. And thank all of you.